Hello and welcome to episode 95 of the Garden Log. This week we're talking about rose pruning and tying in some extravagantly convoluted and twisted, flesh-ripping climbing roses. And I'm also talking a little bit about seed dispersal, about snowdrops and aconites, and about how various seedlings and other garden projects are getting on. There's also a very good question from one of the listeners. It's a surprisingly long episode, so I think we'll keep this introduction pruned and well tied in, like a good late winter rose, and get on with the week in gardening. Welcome to the week in gardening. This week I have found myself bleeding from behind the ears, which is an annual occurrence at around this time, and it means that I've been pruning climbing roses. I don't know if anyone else has similar problems. I think it's because I stick my head inside the thicket, liking to get a little view along the stems and seeing what can be disentangled from what, and then I twitch my head to the side like an attentive little rabbit and end up impaling myself on the back of my ear, which has not had much opportunity to build up callus and is generally neatly punctured. The ear bleeding means we can tell that I'm dealing with fairly man-sized roses. I'm not lying on my front taking on the hybrid teas and getting my ears clipped in that way. I started on Monday by taking back a vast, untamed climber. And when I say untamed, it had been pruned. There had been pruning going on, but it had been almost hedge clippered for years, and hedge clippered in a way that meant it flowers fairly well, but it is an absolute structural mess. It's quite a commonly cited study about rose pruning. I think they did it at Wisley Gardens, where they took to them with a hedge clipper to demonstrate that all this finicky angled cut just above the bud makes no difference to the eventual display. And they were right. They were completely right. The roses bloomed just as well. But what I think happened over the next few years is you've missed the other elements of pruning, the opening up, the taking out of the wood you don't want. And you end up with some sort of strange branching thing, like a city that's been given the right to build its own roads in whatever direction it likes, plants that make no conventional sense. And this is what I was dealing with in this garden, something that had been given enough attention to stop it swallowing passers-by, but with no thought to the structure of the plant. And what I'm trying to do is to take it back to good, long, fresh growth and stretch that out along the wall in that come on, break your buds kind of way that you do to roses. When you stretch them out horizontally, the hormone profile in those stems change. All those auxins around the apical buds start going, whoa, we don't need it just here. We might as well go back along all these other buds. And that's why you'll see, if you look closely at any wall-trained rose, that the effort is to get as much wood going sideways or even slightly down as possible to encourage as much bud break and flowering break as you possibly can. We are lucky in this part of the world, here in a fairly well-to-do part of Copenhagen, that the fences are unusually attractive. The curse of the English garden. And when I say English garden, most people probably think of something from a casting director's little folio book, some sweeping lawns. But actually, believe it or not, the majority of people in Britain live in fairly small, cramped little houses with fairly small, cramped little gardens. And in between these gardens, they have this awful larch lap fencing, which is almost painful to the eyes, because you stand there and you know it's a small space, and the developer has ripped you off as much as he possibly can. And all you want is some sort of sense of generosity in the garden, some sort of sense that you've been given something that could contain some unpaid for value and joy. And instead what you see is your eyes come up dead flat smash into a solid wall of larch lap. And you think this is really a garden built along planning regulations of what habitable space that you can possibly call a garden in a new build development. It's entirely the fault of the property developers and the structure behind the housing market. But it really isn't helped by having such ugly fences. Here the fences are made from a sort of either palisade or horizontal stack of rounds of wood. And quite often they're young larch stems with bark left on. Young larch stems that are about 2 inches, 3 inches in diameter, nailed or screwed onto upright poles. And because they're rounded and they have recognisably grown at some point in the past, and they are a stem, which means they have a fat end and a thin end, they have a sort of visually porous nature. Your eye doesn't hit them and collapse. Your gaze doesn't break its neck. It can filter through a little bit and see a bit of greenery in someone else's garden and barbecue and washing line beyond, which isn't a bad thing at all. We don't necessarily want privacy if it makes us look like we're in solitary confinement in an astroturf prison cell. We are fine to have some connection, even if it's just their blurred outline passing with our neighbours. And this is Denmark anyway, so you can hang around naked in your garden and no one cares. If they do, it's their fault for looking. So we have this fence, which is quite nice. It's a nice thing to work against rather than something particularly ugly, which puts us in an advantageous position to start with. I strung wire along the fence and put most of it at the top in 2 strands, one along the actual top line of the fence and 1.5 feet or so below. And that's because I quite like the effect of a rose that looks like it's running along the top of its structure and cascading down, rather than a rose that looks like it has been printed on a bedsheet and stapled to the fence. So even is its coverage, so flat its flowering. I think that there's lots of people doing very, very exciting things with rose training at the moment. And I love all of those fantastic contorted constructions that people make in the flower borders. The things that look like almost willow sculptures with the rose twining into itself and little bits of twine cleverly used in ties, which you can't really see. So it looks like the whole thing has been plaited into a sort of sculptural blob. And when that flowers, it flowers as a pillar or as a big sumo wrestler of a plant, and it looks fantastic. But what I don't like is the look where you curl and swirl and scroll the roses across a wall or a house in a series of circles tied onto each other. They look like the loops in one of those old wickerwork carpet beaters. It's a very personal preference, but I think that it looks weird in late winter. The houses and walls look almost scribbled in. The shapes are slightly wrong because all of those circles upon circles upon circles don't look good with the straight lines of architecture, whereas they look absolutely fantastic in the inherently blobby bits of nature. For all the joy in wild and wilderness, there is a pleasure to be taken from working with architecture and seeing a rose on a wall that follows the line of stonework or comes up and neatly out over the porch. There's something delightful in that. I think that the circle pruning would look very good on a round sort of tower, like the ones they grow the figs on over at Le Manoir. But not many of us are lucky enough to have a round stone tower to train onto. So what I'm saying is I have trained along the wires. The roses are tied to the wire with a little figure-of-8 loop that can be snipped and redone every couple of years. I've also been looking after my seeds, the ones I was talking about in last episode. The germination has obviously gone completely counter to anything I said in the podcast. Don't listen to experts, particularly gardening experts. That's my advice. The French marigold has not come up, and neither has the eupatorium. There is a chance that they might be, but the others are all racing away. The lunaria and the erodium and the lignus are up and out, and that means that they need to be looked after. A windowsill is fine for when you're getting the seed to show its back, but so quickly they elongate and etiolate and search for the light. Even in a south-facing room, you can't get enough light for a seedling. They're like plants in the mouth of a very, very dark cave. Not even in the mouth, just inside a very, very dark cave, hoping that this filtered light is going to be enough for them. Unless you're a specialized cave floor plant, and these are not, then very quickly you're going to say, well, is there a way to get out of this cave, perhaps and flop myself over the threshold into the sun? What if I just put all of my vigor into this tiny, tiny little thin stem that wouldn't look out of place in the filament of a light bulb, the old-fashioned light bulb, and then your plants very quickly have flopped and fallen over. So now the plants are in that winter I sowed too early dance of being moved outside in the daytime and coming in the evenings. They're not fully outside. We have a good, almost glass-covered porch, south-facing, with a corner in the brickwork, which is a perfect little nursery place. But at the moment, they're still coming in at night because they're babies, they're little babies, and they seem to be doing very well, very happy. I think that maybe plants that use that fluffy helicopter means of dispersal are seeds that are better sown fresh. I think that they probably go off quite quickly. There's various theories about seed dispersal, and I was thinking of this when I saw all the clematis out on the lanes at the moment. The clematis is still holding on to those seeds on those big fluffy feathers that will take them away. And we've gone through various storms with good names, storms with actual meteorological clout here, and they're still on there. And they've been on there since October, November. There is a reason they are staying. And I think they do a little bit of almost pre-germination on the plant. They're bradysporic, which means that they germinate slowly, but they almost start ripening while still on the plant. The little embryo within the seed starts going while it's still clinging to the mother plant. And you can see this because if you sow seeds of clematis, this is Clematis vitalba, the basic hedgerow clematis. If you sow seeds in December, when they're at their finest and fluffiest and at their most, gosh, stop the car, why is that tree covered in candy floss? You get an appalling rate of germination. And if you sow them in March, you get a great rate because they're ready. That's when they detach. That's when they're off to land. And they're banking on moving far away from the mother plant. They're banking on using seed dispersal over space rather than over time. If we rack the back of our brain for school physics lessons, we remember that space and time are measures of distance. That's all they are. Just one, we measure the distance between hours and minutes and decades and centuries and whatever else. And the other, we measure the distance between millimeters and yards and feet and furlong and light years and all of that stuff. And if you want to make sure that your seedlings aren't going to sprout next to their mother plant and end up pollinating their mother plant in the future and creating a horrible inbred little colony, you've got to get away from that mother plant. And you can either do that by separating yourself through distance, by being a little clematis seed or a eupatorium seed and floating off to pastures new, or you can do it by separating yourself in time, by coming up 20 years after you fell to the ground, by lying in the seed bank when mother plant is sadly just a memory and the genetic makeup of your locality has probably changed fairly significantly. That's why very little seeds with no obvious means of dispersal with no feathers or wings or frills tend to do very well in seed storage, tend to come up quite reliably after a couple of years even. That's why the Lychnis, those tiny little half a poppy seed sized things, do so well, because they are designed to wait around in the soil. My Eupatorium were designed to float, to fly free. They didn't need to have a mechanism of dormancy, a mechanism to survive some rather poor seed storage on my behalf. So I think they might have corked it for that reason. Interestingly, this is why very long-lived plants tend to have seeds that germinate straight away. A yew tree or an oak tree will hope that their seed is transported by a jay or a pigeon or something, some distance, but will come up straight away, because you can't wait for that yew to die. The whole country will be underwater by then. You need to separate yourself in distance. Anyway, that's my theory on why the seeds have come up at different rates and different success levels. The retained, fluffy, floating seeds holds true for the Japanese anemone, which is the dominant plant in this particular space that I'm working with at the moment. Vast banks of it. And that, once more, come through the storms, absolutely fluffy, almost cotton plantish in its seed heads now. And you see on a still day like this one we just had, well, still afternoon, got soaked in the morning, still afternoon like this one, you see the little fluffs of seed off on an adventure, off to colonize somewhere new. And that is not a plant that received sufficient wind suddenly to tug it free. That's a plant that has some sort of molecular glue or drying within the old ovary that releases things just now when germination can occur, when the soil is warming up, when there is still ground to lay your seed in before it's been run over by all of those bulbs which are desperately thrusting up and all of those perennials to come. This is the golden moment to get your seed down, and they're doing fantastically well at letting it drift by. I'm starting to cut them back now. They've looked nice all winter. And by nice, obviously, I mean ragged and romantic and only appealing probably to me. But I've liked seeing their different textures and height and all of their frazzled stems and leaf puffs. I've also been out tracking bulb populations and keeping my eye on where we have decent amounts of snowdrops, just the plain old Galanthus nivalis, and of winter aconite, that's Aranthus hymelis. This is an aconite and snowdrop country, I suppose, like the north of England. Every single hedge, every single bit of wasteland almost colonised by them. There's a great sort of gully dip on the way to the local shop that I walk through, and it's not really a space that you'd call a destination. It's next to all of the bins from a large housing complex, and there is one very large concrete planter which has been planted with ivy, and the ivy does its thing and occasionally gets a haircut, and that's it. But even there, the ground is a carpet of snowdrops and winter aconite. It almost makes you think, what's the point of doing any gardening if it all gets done better in the sofa dumping place? I carried on with the pruning on Tuesday and Wednesday, taking things back and tying them in and working around getting into some sort of state of order. And it is now Wednesday evening. I am up here with a glass of wine and the recording equipment, sitting overlooking the garden. It's dark out there, so I'm not really overlooking the garden. I'm overlooking my own face in the glass and contemplating the rest of the week. Anyway, enough of that. In the last episode, you might remember that I said I was going to reinstate the correspondence section of this podcast, the horticultural conundrums. And I was planning to wait until there was a little mailbag built up and to tackle some in one go. But I got such a good email that I can't possibly sit on it. So without further ado, let's deal with a horticultural conundrum. Our horticultural conundrum this week is that of a listener named Jenny, and she sent me such an amusing and well-written email that I am going to read it out in full. In the latest podcast episode, you asked your listeners to send in their horticultural conundrums. Mine, rather fittingly, concerns a front garden. I live on a 1930s suburban street in South Lincolnshire that has a mixture of houses, most still retaining their original matching fences around their front gardens. Most of the front gardens have been lost, at least in part to extra parking, or just seemingly to satisfy an intense love of gravel and glyphosate. I am fortunate that our house still retains a front garden, but this is also the source of my horticultural dilemma. Our front garden has, at some point, been redesigned by a maniac. Not the axe-wielding kind, but the golden shrub-loving kind. The planting consists of every variegated golden or sickly yellow shrub that you can think of, Euonymus fortunei being a clear favourite. This is paired with a plethora of mostly golden conifers. Someone has gone to considerable effort to position 4 large granite boulders to form a central feature from which more distorted dwarf conifers sprawl. I have been brought up with the inclination not to waste anything that my dad would refer to as perfectly serviceable. I also recall Adam Frost once saying that before you remove a mature plant from the garden, you should consider the cost of replacing it with the same plant of the same size. My grandmother, who lives locally, tells me that the garden was designed by a real garden designer, as if this somehow gives it heritage status. I have lived with and endured pruning this golden nightmare for 7 years, and I can take it no longer. I dream of a wildlife-friendly front garden, surrounded by a low beech hedge, underplanted with a sprinkling of snowdrops and cyclamen, with a specimen tree in the centre, preferably multi-stemmed, with more snowdrops, aconites, and cyclamen around the base. If I really wanted to wind up the neighbours, I could lay a small patch of lawn to encourage wildflowers and wildlife. I hear that the 1980s are having a bit of a revival in the world of interiors. I would greatly appreciate your thoughts on the matter. Is it morally wrong to rip something out just because you don't like it? Sadly, all the shrubs are in magnificent health. A very, very excellent email. Thank you, Jenny. You have set a high bar for the return of this feature. The crux of the matter seems to me the moral questions. Is it morally wrong to rip out a healthy, if rather yellow plant? Your vision sounds far, 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 far nicer. My goodness, a lovely multi-stemmed tree, beech hedges, snowdrops and aconites, a garden that breathes with the season. It's perfect. And yes to the lawn, yes to somewhere that looks like you could spread a blanket, even if you never do. I think that's important in a garden. But anyway, this beauty is clouding our moral judgment. It's clouding the question of ethics. So I think probably it's easier to reverse the question. Someone writes to me and says, I have a garden, but it goes all brown in winter and the hedge is all crinkly and I don't like it. And there's this awful gap between the snowdrops and those little yellow plants. And I don't like it because I can see the soil, and then the tree takes ages to come into leaf, ages and ages. Can I start again and replace it all with euonymus so that I can feel a cheerful hit of golden sunshine as I struggle out to buy my paper and pick up my bacon? And maybe a lovely big chamiso Paris, all glowing and weird like a Christmas tree, but a Christmas tree that's been fed on monster energy drink. Can I do that? Is it morally wrong? And to this listener, the anti-Jenny, I would say, it's your garden, it's your place, it's your place to form your memories, to shepherd you back into your house and to cheer you as you head out. You should not be living inside someone else's head, no matter how tasteful. We humans do awful things just by being alive, and as long as you have a garden, as long as you don't put another car on it, then I think that anything that brings joy is something to quest for. So if the anti-Jenny can plant euonymus instead of the multi-stemmed sorbus and the beechhead, then of course, Jenny, of course you should rip out the plants and just add them to your list of moral failings. I'm sure you have loads. We all do. I've got thousands of them. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. As to being brought up with the inclination not to waste anything perfectly serviceable, it is a fine and noble sentiment. But we need to consider if this euonymus is perfectly serviceable. We need to ask, what is the point of a front garden? A front garden's aim should be to bring you joy, and hopefully a few other people as well. They're secondary. If you think about it in other terms, think about it in terms of shoes. You could say, well, these shoes are perfectly serviceable. I mean, I hate wearing them, and everyone laughs at me, and I genuinely dread putting them on every morning, but they're pretty damn serviceable, mind. I don't think that anyone would look at you as a sane person to be trusted with a garden or a pair of shoes if you went around with that sort of attitude. And what else did you say? There was a bit about Adam Frost, the Adam Frost advice, that before you remove a mature plant, you should consider the cost of replacing it with the same plant of the same size. And that's very good advice. And Adam Frost is evidently a very, very sensible fellow. But I would counter it by saying, before you remove a pile of lorry tyres from your garden, consider the cost of replacing all those tyres. Not all plants are created equal. So go, get rid of them. Doesn't matter how much it costs to buy a new twisted up golden thing like that. Just get rid. I do love the idea of your grandmother telling you that the garden was designed by a real garden designer, as if that gives it a heritage status. That's very, very nicely put. I think that long may your grandmother live, while continuing to obviously have never met a garden designer in her life. It's like saying, well, that wall was painted by a real interior designer. And most people are sensible enough to realise that, but I've seen interior designed places and they look bloody awful. The majority of garden designers, and again I stress, there are some brilliant garden designers who do things that I would have thought impossible. But the majority of them somehow specialise in stripping the life from a place. And anyway, the garden designer who put this in was your predecessor's garden designer. They were working to a client's brief. That's what they do. They were not working in the service of universal ideals of beauty. Evidently their client was some sort of King Midas wannabe who said, I'll have it all gold, and if you can't make it glitter and you can't make it shine, then you can at least make it yellow. And the garden designer maybe fulfilled that brief perfectly, but you have no obligation to that person who lusted after yellow, and you don't have any obligation to his garden designer. That contract is done. You lust for pearls, for snowdrops, and snowdrops and pearls are more classy than gold and euonymus. But I do like the sound of the boulders, so maybe they should stay. Anyway, I think you sound very capable. You sound like a very capable gardener, and you probably don't need actual definite advice. But I would say you could get on with it now. You could cut the euonymus back really, really hard, almost tomorrow, and then try to dig up the plants, dig them up, separating them from their hedge. And if they're back almost to a twigs and stumps and things like that, you could put them in pots or just in big bags and put up a sign saying take me. And some people might really want some bright and cheer and some euonymus areas. You could put the RRP price of how much they'd cost as mature plants to keep Adam Frost happy. And it would certainly assuage some of that moral guilt about destroying good and healthy and well-rooted plant. The dwarf pines and the conifers are probably goners. They don't move well when they're mature, particularly if they've been planted into the crevices of a rock where you're going to end up snapping out quite a lot of those larger roots and loads and loads of the finer roots. So unfortunately, they are done for. But you could always hire a chipper and chip them, store them for a bit, and then chuck them out around your new hedges and use them as a way to keep the weeds off, those little whips of beech you're planting. And then in a way you have given the garden to the garden. There is a continuity. Your new plants have consumed the old, and maybe one day you will see the light low through those autumn beech, and you'll see it yellow and think, there it is. There's my euonymus. Anyway, I hope that helped. I think you've probably got quite a busy year ahead of you, so do send us an update, and I'll follow the progress of your garden on the podcast. If anyone else would like to follow Jenny's wonderful lead, don't feel intimidated. You don't have to write so well and humorously. You can just mash your keys, and as long as I can string together some sort of horticultural question, then I'll do my best to answer on the podcast. So for those kind of inquiries, please do write to thegardenlogpodcast@gmail.com. I won't be doing a horticultural conundrum next week, as I have quite a good recommendation for you. But the week after, I'd like to read out one or two. So that's thegardenlogpodcast@gmail.com. You can also pre-order the book, The Grove, A Natural Odyssey in 19.5 front gardens. All pre-orders greatly, greatly appreciated. And if you particularly enjoyed anything this episode, then you can contribute by going to Ko-Fi, that's ko-fi/Ben Dark, and clicking one of the little Buy Me a Coffee buttons. So until next week, I hope that you have a wonderful garden. Not a wonderful garden. I hope that you're working towards a wonderful garden. I hope you are having a wonderful time doing whatever it is you do in the interim. And I will be back to talk to you in the next episode of The Garden Log. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.